Welcome everybody to part 2 of my miniseries analyzing why the Rings of Power sucks. If you haven't seen part 1 and would like to watch that video first before watching this one, then the link to there will be in the description. However, you don't have to watch part 1 first in order to understand part 2, so if you just want to watch part 2 first and then watch part 1 after, that's totally fine as well. So today we are going to start taking a look at all the subplots present in Season 2. They are all terrible, but some I do think are noticeably worse than others. So today specifically, we are going to take an in-depth look at the Lindon Subplot as well as the Mordor Subplot. We'll start with Lindon since they are the protagonists in the story, so let's jump straight in, shall we? The season starts off with Galadriel chasing Elrond for the 3 Elven Rings of Power. This entire scene is all pretty dumb because this entire chase could easily stop if Galadriel would just tell Elrond that the rings were forged by Sauron. And Elrond would have ultimately agreed because he didn't want to use the rings after he knew that they were forged by Sauron. When the rings are delivered by Elrond to the High King, for all of his supposed wisdom, he decides to use the Elven rings that very well may have been corrupted by Sauron. His justification is that if they don't use the rings, then the peoples of Middle-earth might be subjected to the tyranny of the Dark Lord. The key word there is might. If you really wanted to use the Rings of Power but don't want to risk Sauron's corruption, there's an obvious solution here. Just make more Rings of Power that aren't corrupted by Sauron in any way. Celebrimbor knows how to make them now, so why doesn't he just make new ones? Is the show really trying to say that they have to use these specific rings right now? Why? Because the last leaf will fall? Just take a couple more weeks to forge some new rings and then heal the tree. Why are you acting so irrationally as if you're going to die in a matter of seconds if you don't use these rings? I don't know, it's all so stupid. It's all so contrived just so the plot can happen, even though it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you give further explanation as to why this has to occur. But the show doesn't really explain why they have to do this right now beyond, our time will end. What does that even mean? You can't just throw generic-ass statements out there and expect us to know what you're talking about. After Elrond refuses to hand the rings over to Gil-galad because he believes they likely have been corrupted by Sauron, he jumps off the side of a waterfall to escape with the rings, to seek out someone who he can trust. He makes his way to Círdan, who we are told is the oldest and wisest of all the elves in Middle-earth. Elrond tells Círdan the circumstances in which the rings were crafted and why he's so worried about their possible corruption. And Círdan agrees because he proceeds to ride out to the Bay of the Sea to cast the rings into the depth of the ocean. But looks like he changed his mind. Looks like Elrond was right. The rings definitely look like they're corrupting him. And the logic that Círdan gives later for why he has ultimately switched sides is beyond stupidity. That being, you wouldn't cast away the writings of a great poet just because he was a drunkard. Therefore, we shouldn't cast away these beautiful and powerful rings just because they were made by Sauron. Now, while I understand his logic about the poet, there's a pretty significant difference between a drunk poet and the Satan of Middle-earth. So no, your logic does not make sense in this situation, and you probably were just corrupted by the rings, proving Elrond right. Círdan then goes to deliver the 3 rings to Gil-galad, and despite all of Galadriel's constant fuck-ups, she is allowed to keep one of the 3 elven rings. Despite withholding the information to properly warn Celebrimbor that Halbrand, the man that he crafted the 3 elven rings with, and a man that may very well return, she is for some reason allowed to keep one of the 3 elven rings of power. This is absolutely insane why she is allowed to do this. And I guess the best explanation we can give for this is, the ring chose her, I guess. I guess this Galadriel just gets to keep the ring because in the eyes of the writers, she can do no wrong, because she faces 0 consequences for her actions. Anyways, King Gil-galad begins preparations for an invasion of Mordor, but also decides to send Elrond and Galadriel on a side quest to Eregion after he and Galadriel have disturbing visions of Celebrimbor and the fate of Eregion. This is where the Lindon plot splits into 2. So for now, we'll follow Elrond and Galadriel and cycle back to Gil-galad when it's appropriate. So Galadriel, Elrond, and a small company of elves set off for Eregion. All goes well until they reach a broken bridge that they determine has been destroyed by Sauron, because apparently Sauron knew that a company of elves was going to take this exact route in an effort to stop him. Seems a little far-fetched, don't you think? And of course, this is the only safe and efficient route to get from Lindon to Eregion in any timely manner. You'd think that the elves of all people would have multiple roads, routes, and bridges that would connect their seemingly 2 biggest cities, but nope, they don't. So I guess they're going to have to go through the super evil forest that totally is an excuse to have a fight scene, cause it's the only other way in which they can get to Eregion in any timely or efficient manner. Now I'm not necessarily opposed to having something go wrong in which our heroes are forced off the path that they were headed on. The most obvious example that I can think of from Middle-earth that just comes to the top of my head is the scene in Desolation of Smaug in which the company of dwarves are forced to go through Mirkwood even though they all know it's dangerous. But in the case of that scenario, there was actually a reason for why they decided to go through the spooky forest. The forest was hundreds of miles long, and trying to go around it would have added weeks to their journey, and they were also actively being hunted by orcs. But in Rings of Power, it's written this way because the writers want to add in an unnecessary fight scene in order to add tension that feels entirely forced, not something that was built up to very well by the story. But anyways, they enter the spooky forest and come into contact with the Barrow-wights. And besides the fact that this fight scene is very forgettable, there are also some conflicting elements of knowledge that's really bizarre in the way that it plays out. So right when the Barrow-wights reveal themselves, I believe it's Asian Elf that asks, "What are those things?" And Galadriel responds with, "They're Barrow-wights." About 30 seconds later, another elf says, "They're impervious to our weapons." And about 30 seconds after that, Elrond says something along the lines of, "According to ancient lore, you have to use the weapons that they were buried with in order to kill them." Cause apparently, Elrond has a deep knowledge on the lore of Barrow-wights. Elrond, why are you telling us this now? You don't think this would have been good to know 2 minutes ago? You just had to wait for one of your elf companions to get eaten by the forest butthole and everyone almost die for you to reveal this critical information? After the fight concludes, Galadriel says that something evil has awoken them. If you haven't caught on yet, seemingly every time this show needs an explanation for why something occurred, but there is no obvious reason for that occurrence. The writers just chalk it up to, it was Sauron doing evil magic shit off screen. That's why the bridge was broken, that's why the Barrow-wights attacked, and that's why seemingly everything in this season happens. Because Sauron. It's all his grand plan, you see. Skipping ahead now to the end of episode 4, after a short conversation between Elrond and Galadriel, the elves hear drumming banging off in the distance. Shortly after, they are discovered by a group of orcs, one of them gets struck by an arrow, and we get our first glimpse of the healing abilities of the Elven Rings of Power. It's not a terrible 1 to 2 minute stretch, but then immediately goes back to shit when Galadriel decides that she has to sacrifice herself, for no reason at all. They could all very easily just slip away quietly before the orcs track them down, but the writers aren't going to allow that to happen because they need the plot to happen. Galadriel gives Elrond the ring, and what follows is another corny action scene that's ended by Adar capturing Galadriel, and the episode ends. So we are now at the point of the story where the Lindon plot now splits into 3. Galadriel has essentially entered the Mordor subplot at this point, Elrond and his company are now on their own, as well as all the stuff happening back in the city with Gil-galad. Now, as to avoid jumping all over the place, I'm mainly going to follow Galadriel for the rest of this section, but I will occasionally jump back to Elrond and Gil-galad as I see fit. So while Galadriel is in Adar's custody, he taunts her and says that he knows that Halbrand is Sauron. This makes absolutely no sense. How on earth would Adar know that Halbrand is Sauron? And when exactly did he make this discovery? It must have happened after he let Halbrand go in episode 1 because he clearly didn't suspect anything then, so what we have here is yet another major plot gap. It's possible that he could have come by this information, but we never see him make this discovery. So essentially, it all must have happened off-screen. Later on, Adar and Galadriel continue their chat, and Adar shows off to Galadriel the power of his army that he intends to invade Eregion with. But then Galadriel pulls out the, "Oh no, you can't do that. This is all part of his master plan. He wants you to attack the city that he's helping forge the Rings of Power in currently." Ah yes, Sauron's master plan. Lure in the army that hates him so he can take it over, even though he already tried and failed miserably trying to do that very thing in the prologue. Got it. So Adar dismisses Galadriel's concerns because obviously that would be a dumb plan on Sauron's part and surely can't be real. The only way that works would be if the show were to decide to write in a massive character retcon for the orcs. But surely the writers wouldn't do that. Oh, wait. Adar blows his big horn, and we are now on the doorstep of one of the most massive battles in history. It's here that the Lindon plotline and the Mordor plotline start to interloop. So I'm going to skip the tactics of the actual battle for now because I'm going to discuss it later in the Mordor section of the video, but instead we'll focus on some of the major things that happen to our characters inside of the Battle of Eregion. So we have now reached the dreaded episode 7, probably the worst episode in the entirety of Rings of Power. Elrond shows up with the army of Lindon, and instead of using using basic militaristic logic and continuing his charge all the way through, he instead decides to have a sit-down with Udar. During this sit-down, Udar offers Elrond Galadriel's life in exchange for the Elven Ring. Elrond rightfully declines because that would be idiotic, and you'd think that would just be the end of it. But no, Udar allows Elrond to give Galadriel one last goodbye, even though he has no reason to grant Elrond this. Elrond gives Galadriel one of the most out-of-place kisses I have ever seen, and very quote-unquote sneakily hands Galadriel a gadget that he took from his cape as a means to free herself. Although this isn't very sneaky at all, cause it's obvious that everybody in that tent is watching this exchange happen, and should obviously notice that Elrond hands something to Galadriel however subtle it may be. But the writers don't allow anybody in the room to possess any sort of sense whatsoever, because they need the plot to happen. So later on, Galadriel escapes from her chains, but now has to try and blend in and successfully maneuver her way through the orc encampment in order to escape. She does okay for a while, but is eventually discovered. Welp, it's all over for you now, Galadriel. Unless... Boom! Arondir spawns in to save her exactly when the plot needs him to. Galadriel thanks Arondir for conveniently saving her, stops him from going on a temper tantrum and killing himself, and then sneaks into Eregion through a secret path that she knows. When she arrives, she sees that Celebrimbor is being seized by soldiers, and stops the soldiers from doing so. Even though Anatar is now the proclaimed Lord of Eregion and the soldiers are seemingly loyal to him, they just go along with Galadriel's orders for them to stand down, even though she shouldn't have any authority over Anatar at this point. Galadriel and Celebrimbor have an exchange of words, in which Celebrimbor gives Galadriel the Rings of Men. And the elven guards overhearing this conversation just decide, you know what? You're right, Celebrimbor, we stand with you. Anatar is Sauron. Even though Celebrimbor tried to convince them earlier and they didn't believe him, so the fact that they believe him now feels completely contrived, especially considering that no new evidence has been presented to convince the guards that yes, Anatar is in fact Sauron. From here, I'm going to skip to the final confrontation between Galadriel and Sauron. I will discuss the events she's involved in leading up to this, but I'll leave it for the Mordor section because a lot of it has tactical implications on the battle at large. So Galadriel is taken to Udar by the orcs and oh shit, he's hot. The Elven Ring made him hot. Careful, Galadriel. We know you have a tendency to fall for very evil, attractive men. The orcs then betray Udar and kill him, which completely breaks the show, but I've already discussed that in detail in part 1, and my god, I do not want to do it again. Which means now it's time for the final battle between Galadriel and Sauron. Now, I'm not going to say that this fight is the worst thing that I've ever seen, but it certainly isn't good, and in fact, it's far from good. First of all, I'm not too knowledgeable on the expanded Tolkien lore, but I find it completely unbelievable that Galadriel would be able to put up this much of a fight against a being like Sauron the way that she does. It's pretty obvious to me that they stretched out this sequence for as many minutes as they can get out of it. If you take a look at the choreography, I will say that this is for sure, in my mind, one of the weakest fight sequences we've seen in the show. There are so many unnecessary spins that leave them extremely exposed, that after like the 7th time it happens, I just find myself asking over and over, why are you spinning? Why are you spinning? Stop spinning. You don't need to spin. Eventually, Sauron finally stops fucking around and brutally stabs her in the heart. She of course survives, however, jumps off the side of a cliff, and the final season-ending duel has come to an end, and has already been forgotten about 5 minutes later. Galadriel somehow survives this immense fall from great heights. The fact that she isn't a big pile of goo after something like that is just completely ridiculous. Elrond then decides to use the Ring of Power to save Galadriel's life, even though he has been characterized this whole season as being vehemently against using the rings. Now, you could argue that this could be seen as character progression, but I'd on the other hand argue that this is more of a character destruction. After Galadriel is healed by the combined power of 2 elven rings, the remaining surviving elves retreat from Eregion to dwell by the river that is said to be safe. Gil-galad holds up his sword to the rest of the elven people in an effort to be symbolic, I guess, and the season finally ends. My god, thank the Lord that it is over. In summary, the Lindon plot is an absolute disaster. It is littered with contrivances, filled with story beats that don't make a shred of sense, numerous amounts of character assassinations, and just an overall bore. While I don't think that the Lindon Subplot is the worst storyline in Rings of Power, that title would go to Sauron and Celebrimbor due to how damaging it is to the overall narrative. Lindon is certainly up there because it also does a great deal of damage to the overarching story. But now that we've covered everything from the Lindon side of the story, I'm now going to shift gears and talk about the other side of the conflict, that being the Mordor Subplot. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, the Mordor Subplot eventually combines with Galadriel's part of the story. So what I'm going to do with this section is I'm going to briefly talk about the first 3 episodes in Mordor before it combines with Galadriel. And from there, I'll skip to episode 7 and discuss the dreaded Battle of Eregion. So, now that we're on the same page, let's get into the Mordor plot, shall we? As we make our way back into the plot of Mordor, we see that Waldreg, I guess, has been promoted to Adar's right-hand man, presumably. I mean, I guess it makes sense. He literally single-handedly created Mordor, and caused the Númenóreans' defeat and retreat back to Númenor. However, there is one major character contradiction that happens with Waldreg once Halbrand reveals that Sauron is still alive. If you remember back to Season 1, Waldreg said that he comes from a long line of devout Sauron worshippers, and wishes to worship Sauron himself. But it seems like the writers just forgot about this character trait because Waldreg seemingly doesn't care that the master he felt destined to serve is alive. The show just artificially rewrites Waldreg as now being a devout worshipper of Adar to a fold. The writing errors here are obvious, but it's also a missed opportunity. It could have added another layer to Waldreg's character in this season outside of just being the welcome to Mordor guy.
Welcome to Mordor!
It could have been interesting to see him try and escape Adar's encampment, so he could go off and worship the true Dark Lord. But instead, the writers just decide to unceremoniously kill him off by having a dog bite off his head. Rest in peace, Waldreg. But anyways, I'm going to skip over the stupidity of Halbrand's plan and negotiations with Adar as to avoid repeating myself because I already talked about it in part 1, so I'll fast forward to episode 3. The orcs are now preparing for their conquest of Eregion when Adar summons Damrod, a giant troll who was a big nothing of a character. Seriously, I don't know why on earth he was included in the story. They hype him up the whole season as if he's going to play a major role in the downfall of Eregion, but he doesn't. He storms the walls, dies in a forgettable fashion, and that's it. All the time spent with him is an absolute waste of time because he doesn't serve any purpose in progressing the story whatsoever. But anyways, sorry I went on a little tangent about Damrod there. The orcs are now on the move towards Eregion when a group of orcs discover Elrond's party in the middle of the forest. Now I already touched on this scene back in the Lindon section, so I'm going to skip ahead as to avoid repeating myself. I'm actually going to skip ahead quite a bit, all the way to episode 7, because mostly everything that happens after this point in the Mordor plot line before we get to episode 7 involves Galadriel, which I discussed earlier. So I promised that for this section, when we got to the Battle of Eregion, that I'd discuss everything wrong with the actual battle itself. And there is a significant amount of things wrong with this battle, and it's pretty easy to see them when you just take a step back and think about what's actually happening for more than 2 seconds. But I quickly want to take an even further step back and shine light on a battle that is often being compared to the one that we see here, that being the Battle of Helm's Deep. On the surface, these two battles are pretty similar. We have a massive orc army trying to scale a massive wall so they can destroy the city behind it. But obviously the Battle of Helm's Deep is significantly better than the Battle of Eregion, but why? Well, besides the fact that the tactics seen in the Battle of Helm's Deep are much more fleshed out and make a whole lot more of sense, Helm's Deep does a much better job of portraying the actual battle that is going on. Before the battle actually takes place, we spend a decent amount of time inside of Helm's Deep, so we're able to get a very good understanding of the fortress itself and the geography surrounding it. So by the time that the orcs come, we know exactly what is going on and where the characters are at any given time. The Battle of Eregion, on the other hand, doesn't do this very well. All we really get to establish the geography surrounding Eregion is the occasional establishing shot of the city, as well as the one shot of a drawn map that Arondir found on an orc that he killed. And because the show doesn't take the time to actually give us a deep understanding of the battleground that this battle will be taking place in, it's very easy to get lost in what exactly is even happening or where exactly the characters are at any given time. And as a result, it's much harder to comprehend the entirety of the battle itself. But now that I've got all the contextual stuff out of the way, what exactly happens in the Battle of Eregion? Well, the orcs start out by besieging the city, launching a ton of boulders with trebuchets in an attempt to weaken the elven defenses. This is pretty standard stuff, but the problem is we have no idea exactly how long this is going on for, as the siege takes place in episodes 6 through 7. I initially assumed that it must have been a few days at tops, but it is entirely unclear. However, after the show concluded, the writers of the show answered this question by saying that the siege went on for weeks. which makes the fact that the elves in all that time didn't bother with launching any sort of counterattack absolute insanity. After weeks of besieging the city, the orc army eventually decides to launch some of their boulders at the nearby mountain, and as a result, the entire mountain comes falling down and dams the river separating the orc army from Eregion. And I know that I've said a lot of things so far have been stupid, but this has to be the stupidest thing I have seen in the entirety of the show. The fact that these rocks are able to bring down the mountain to the scale at which they do shows that the writers officially have lost all their brain cells. That is not how physics works. They would have to be throwing rocks at that mountain for weeks if they ever wanted to bring the whole thing down. But all it takes is a couple of launches. And even if you want to argue, yes, Night Swan, this is definitely possible, okay, you can argue that if you want, but the fact that the falling rocks dam the river so perfectly that the orcs can cross it as if it's just a flat surface is hysterical. This is beyond far-fetched. This is just the writers going with the first thing that comes into their heads without taking any more than 2 seconds to think about the logistics of what they're actually writing. Also, even if they have successfully dammed the river, they shouldn't be able to cross it for a significant amount of time. You want to know why? Because they would sink in the mud. Have you ever tried to walk on land that has been submerged underwater for a significant amount of time? You can't, because the ground is still so damp that it's basically like chunky liquid. It's like trying to walk through quicksand. It's going to very quickly submerge you down to your knees. But once again, like I said, these writers don't take more than 2 seconds to think about the logistics of what they're actually writing. So the orcs begin to advance towards the wall, but they don't have much trouble reaching it because there's nowhere near enough elven archers to repel them. I did a rough count and there's maybe 24 elves that we can actually see shooting back. Are you kidding me? This is the entire strength of Eregion's forces? Remember how in Helm's Deep that the elves and men were shoulder to shoulder with a bunch more to spare on the ground fighting back? That felt realistic. This feels like the editing team ran out of time before they could CGI in more elves. The storming of the wall seemingly goes on for a while until the army of Lindon shows up on their flank. The Lindon army charges, but then stops right at the last second when the orc army reveals that they have Galadriel in a cage right at the front lines. But the fact that they stop is really stupid considering they're charging at great speed on horses. All you have to do is continue forward for like 2 more seconds and then you'll just run them all over, and then can take back Galadriel. And even if you're worried that they'd have enough time to get in a quick stab on Galadriel, that's not really a concern anymore considering that Elrond is now in possession of one of the Elven Rings of Power that has been shown to be able to heal mortal wounds. But the writers don't allow for this basic militaristic logic, so we can instead have a pointless sit down between the opposing sides as leaders. After the exchange is over and doesn't lead to any resolution, later on the elves chase the orc army back into the forest. But this isn't really the smartest thing to do considering the majority of their army is on horseback, and it is definitely harder to defeat an army on horseback when you're in the forest, and have to outmaneuver all the obstacles in your way, instead of on open land where you can just charge and don't really have to worry about running into anything. During the skirmish, Elrond has a confrontation with an orc, where he kills him. The orc falls into the catapult, and then Elrond launches it for some reason, even though it's directed directly at the very city that he's trying to defend. Meanwhile, a portion of the orc army is still attacking the walls of the city. They have made significant advancements and the ladders are now going up. Welp, you'd think it's over for the elven army now, considering that they only have like 24 archers at their disposal. But nope. The 24 elves are able to successfully push back a massive chunk of the orc army. I don't think I really need to explain why that's stupid, so I will move on. Skip forward to nighttime, and the army of Lindon has now come to the aid of the 24 archers in fighting the remaining orcs surrounding the wall. The tide of the battle seems to be on their side, but it's made clear that they have to take down the siege engine because it's about to break through the wall. And what follows is the saddest attempt at a last stand death scene for a background elf that nobody knows the name to, in a pitiful attempt to try and recreate the epic last stand of Boromir from Lord of the Rings. The destruction of the siege engine seems to really give the elves the momentum now, although I am entirely guessing because it is very unclear who is actually winning, but the orcs have to retaliate in some way, so Adar finally decides to send in Damrod. Now why he waited this long to send Damrod in, instead of just sending him in with the rest of the army from the get-go, is entirely unclear, but the writers probably did this just so they could have their big troll sequence towards the end of the episode. Even Even though, from a logical perspective, it doesn't make much sense why Adar has waited this long to use his biggest weapon, especially considering that it's made very clear earlier in the episode by Glug that the Orc army has been taking heavy losses. But regardless, he is finally sent in. However, after he gets hit with many arrows, gets hit in the tummy really hard, and stabbed a multitude of times by Elrond, Gil-galad, and Arondir, Damrod dies. Yup, he's just dead. They kill him off without having him kill anybody significant or change the course of the battle in any significant way. So his inclusion in this season and the build-up they gave him feels entirely pointless and was just a giant waste of time. So after Damrod is defeated, Adar finally decides to join in on the fight himself and gathers what remaining forces that he has and charges towards the wall. And they're obviously going to win at this point because the elves only have like 30 or 40 remaining soldiers left. During the skirmish, Arondir has a one-on-one face-off with Adar, during which he takes a mortal blow to his vital organs, but somehow survives because of course he does, even though him being able to survive this is completely nonsensical. Adar also defeats Elrond and takes the Elven Ring from him. Now the fact that Elrond would take the Elven Ring into battle when that's one of the things that Adar greatly desires also makes no sense. It's never shown or explicitly stated that wearing or being in possession of an Elven Ring gives you anything like increased strength, increased endurance, or anything else that would enhance one's fighting abilities. So the fact that Elrond brung the ring along with him to the fight instead of just leaving it with someone in the Elven camp that he can trust is just sheer idiocy. And with that, we have finally reached the end of the dreaded episode 7. Oh my god, that was a slog to get through. But we are not done quite yet, because we still have to get through the season finale, Shadow and Flame. So the orcs finally breach the walls and storm Eregion, and attempt to kill whatever elven civilians and soldiers are still within the city walls. The fact that there is anybody left in the city still besides military personnel is just stupid, considering that we later learn that there are multiple hidden ways out of the city that the civilians could have escaped through, and the fact that this siege has been going on for weeks. But eventually, Galadriel decides to lead some of the civilians out of one of the secret entrances. However, a bunch of orcs are waiting for them at the exit. Now, the orcs knowing about this doesn't make any sense because why would they know about it? And the fact that they do also does further damage to the overall narrative, because if they knew about this entrance the entire time, then why wouldn't they utilize it? Why wouldn't they send a big chunk of their forces through it from the get-go, in an attempt to destroy Eregion from the inside out? Meanwhile, however, the orcs begin to raise Eregion, as well as gathering up all of the elven leaders. They also start destroying a bunch of very important stuff, which rightfully pisses the elves off. But right on cue, the dwarves have finally arrived to give the elves the aid that they earlier promised. And just in case you couldn't tell who these people were, Gil-galad is happy to remind us that the little people in armor are in fact dwarves. So thank you, Gil-galad. I was struggling to put 2 and 2 together there. After the dwarves come to the elves' aid, the combined strength of what's left of the elves and the dwarves defeat the remaining orcs in the city. And what happens after this point is entirely unclear. All we get to my knowledge is one last shot of Sauron holding Celebrimbor's hammer, and that's it. So I guess we're just going to have to fill in the blanks. Presumably Sauron has taken whatever orcs remain and retreated back to Mordor, but that is entirely my best guess. We don't know for sure. And that concludes the dreaded Mordor plot. In summary, the Mordor plot, similar to the Lindon plot, is absolutely terrible. The first half of the season in Mordor is pretty scarce for meaningful content and plot points. But when we finally get to what was supposed to be the good stuff, the Battle of Eregion, what we received was one of the most poorly written sequences of fantasy warfare of all time. And that may very well be what Season 2 is remembered for. Years from now, when people look back on the second season, it may very well be dumbed down to, oh yeah, that was the season with the really stupid battle in it. And as sad as that is to say, that's just the reality. But thank God it is over for now. And with that, I'm gonna cut it off here for part 2. If you made it this far and you enjoyed the video, then please, do me a favor by leaving a like and hitting that subscribe button. Any support would be much appreciated. Stay tuned for part 3. It is currently in the works and I'll be sure to get it out as soon as it's done. If you're watching this video a significant amount of time in the future, then you can find the link to part 3 in the description as well as in the outro. And finally, if you have any thoughts of your own about the Lindon Subplot, the Mordor Subplot, or just Rings of Power in general, then make sure to leave them in the comments. Whether you agree with what I've said or disagree, I'm always interested to hear your guys' thoughts. But anyways, with all that said, that's going to do it for today, guys. I will see you in the next one.